Well, good afternoon, everybody. I am Mike Petrilli, the president here at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, and I really appreciate folks that are here in person and also what we expect to be a very large audience tuning in online. For those of you who are new to the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, we are one of the nation's leading education policy think tanks. We do research, we do commentary on all the big reform issues. We also do on-the-ground work in the great state of Ohio. That's where Thomas B. Fordham was from. We have a shop in Columbus that works to promote policy reforms at the state level. And then out of Dayton, we are a charter school authorizer. And we authorize about a dozen schools in Columbus, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Dayton, and one school in Appalachian, Ohio. So we like to think that keeps us somewhat grounded in the real world, which can be a challenge when you work at a Washington think tank. We are here to talk about a really tough issue, and it's the issue that has gotten so much attention, certainly in recent months, but also in recent years, which is whether and how to address the alarming racial disparities that we see in the use of exclusionary school discipline, including out-of-school suspensions. This has become a big issue really because for the better part of a decade now, there's been a coalition of civil rights groups and other organizations who have been pushing school districts to dramatically reduce their use of suspensions and the like, especially for kids of color. And then, of course, in 2014, the Obama administration took up the cause with a Dear Colleague letter to the local school districts that applied disparate impact theory to the issue of school discipline. And it warned districts that they could be investigated if their data showed significant disparities in discipline by race, and that they could be found guilty of violating kids' civil rights, even if they had race-neutral discipline policies that were being implemented even-handedly, but if they were still resulting in big disparities by race. Now, back then in 2014, a number of observers, including myself, expressed some significant concerns with that letter, as a few of the folks that served in the Obama administration probably recall. And partly this was legal concerns around disparate impact theory, but really for me it was mostly the worry about what we saw as a very likely unintended consequences of this policy. We worried about whether schools and school systems, and especially dysfunctional school systems, would be capable of reducing suspensions without increasing disorder and even violence in the classroom. And we worried whether disorder would lead to a lot less learning for the vast majority of kids who were following the rules. And given the state of many of our school systems being so segregated and racially isolated, that those kids that are the ones who are behaving and following the rules and may potentially be negatively impacted were themselves kids of color and low-income kids. And so would our efforts to focus on raising achievement and close achievement gaps be stalled in some way by this effort? And finally, this worry that whether or not, even if that was not the intention, if we were starting to reintroduce a new form of a soft bigotry of low expectations, and in this case, low expectations around student behavior, saying that, well, okay, the kid might have dropped the F-bomb on their teacher, but we need to be understanding of what's happening in that kid's life and all of the challenges they're faced, et cetera, et cetera. And that, again, was a form of the soft bigotry of low expectations that wasn't doing that kid any good, and also wasn't sending a positive message to all the other children and to the teachers in that school, that we really believe in high expectations for everybody. So those were a number of our concerns. And so some of us have been encouraging the new administration for the last year to rescind and replace that 2014 policy, which we understand from press reports they are considering doing. Now, our purpose today is not to obsess about the federal policy angle. I know it's going to come up, and of course it will, and it's of course timely and important, but really what we want to do today is to try to get at how this reform is playing out on the ground in the real world. Keep in mind that there were discipline reforms happening before the 2014 policy, and in fact we're going to talk a lot today about Philadelphia, which started its own reforms before the 2014 policy, and it's a great case study because we have some data because it was one of the earliest adopters of these kinds of reforms. So we really want to understand that. We're going to start with a panel to talk about some recent research studies on Philadelphia, again, as a case study, one that was published by Fordham and one that was published by the Center for Policy Research and Education. And so we'll hear about the results. My colleague Amber Northern is going to moderate that panel. And then we're going to have a second panel where several of us are going to come up and have a discussion, and I'm sure a debate, about what we are seeing on the ground, how we think these things are playing out, not just in Philadelphia, but in other cities around the country, and what that should mean for school discipline going forward. Okay. Whew. So, couple last things. We are curious about how our audience here and online views some of these issues, and we also want to see if views change over the course of the next 2 hours. So we're going to do a little fun. If you can take out your smartphones and play along, that would be great. Go to menti.com, menti.com. I see you squinting back there, Steve. Come on, get some glasses. I know, you are. And then use the code 429081. Okay, and we're going to take a little poll, and the question is, should districts ban out-of-school suspensions for low-level offenses? Okay, so again, menti.com, code 429081. I'm not going to say any more than this about what we mean by low-level offenses, okay, but let's just ask this basic question. Should districts ban out-of-school suspensions for low-level offenses? Let's just see where we're at with that. We'll give you a few moments. Folks online, you can do this too. I will say, for those of us in the audience, at the end of this, well, what could be a tough discussion, I want you to know we are going to have a reception, and we've got the beer and wine chilling. If it gets tough, if it gets too tough ahead of time, we might just roll it out, okay, for the debate portion. I don't see any reason why. It will be 5 o'clock by then, so, All right. Come on, we don't have too many voters. Get on there and vote. We'll give it a few more. Well, all right, there we go. There we go. Okay. Well, our yeses are definitely winning. All right, what do you think? Our professors who do math all day, what does that look like? About more than 2 to 1, almost 3 to 1. All right, interesting. All right, well, we'll remember these results for later. We'll see if they change at all. All right, the couple last things. The hashtag for the event is hashtag school discipline. Is that right, Karen? Yeah, hashtag school discipline. That's easy. Oh, I'm sorry. Hashtag discipline reform. Got to get that right. Discipline reform. Okay. And I suspect we'll have a lively conversation on Twitter. There certainly has been a lively conversation on Twitter about this issue in recent weeks. And now, without further ado, let me welcome my colleague, Fordham Senior Vice President for Research, a former high school English teacher herself, Amber Northern.
Thanks, Mike. All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is on, right? It's on. All right. So thanks for joining our first panel. I noticed it is, Mike, you did great. 4:10, right? That's when you're supposed to start? All right. We're going to try to keep the trains rolling on time so all panels can start and begin and get you guys out on time and all that good stuff. So the first thing I want to say is how pleased I am to be able to just kind of lead this discussion about these two studies, because although they were not in any way officially partnered or collaborated or any of that stuff, what's kind of cool is when you look at the two of them together, we've got administrative data, we've got achievement data, we've got interview data, we've got focus group data, we've got survey data. I mean, we've got all these different types of data sources that really, I think the two papers, although they're parallel, they combine to give us a pretty rich portrait of what is going on and has been going into Philadelphia in the wake of this new reform. So our goal here today is not only to discuss these findings and this rich data set, but it's also to sort of get a Cliff Notes version of what the larger body of literature around school discipline says. Because if you've, like me, ever actually tried to read all the various studies that have come out in several years, it's exceedingly hard to say anything with conviction about the body of literature for reasons I'm sure that we'll get into. It's not an easy topic to study, so we'll talk about that a little bit. It requires quite a bit of discussion around what methodology did you use and what questions can and can't answer with that precise methodology. So it gets in the weeds pretty quickly, but we're going to do our best to kind of give you the best knowledge we can and kind of keep it at a level that we can all engage in. It's my understanding, again, we have about 40 minutes. We're going to tackle audience questions, I think, after both panels are over. But if we end a little bit early on this panel and you guys have a burning question or two, I'm happy to take that if we can do it. So let me introduce my guests first. We have Abigail Gray, Senior Research Investigator at the Consortium for Policy Research in Education at the University of Pennsylvania. As Mike mentioned, she's lead author of the report Discipline in Context, Suspension, Climate, and PBS in the School District of Philadelphia. You've got her report cover up there. And we also have Matthew Steinberg, who's the Associate Professor of Education Policy at the University of Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Hopefully, sorry, and lead author of the Academic and Behavioral Consequences of Discipline Policy Reform, Evidence from Philadelphia, are published in December, and Abby, yours was in October.
November.
Oh, November. Okay, so just a couple months apart. So that's really great. So the first thing I told these guys when we talked last week when we were trying to go over the sort of how the panel was going to run and all this was that when we get super smart academic folks on panels like this and we ask them, what did your research tell us? It can get real weedy real quick for a DC audience because we're not at APAM, right? We're at Fordham, and so I said, can I do something which is try to summarize a few of your key findings in a handful of slides, and then you tell me if I botched it up, what I forgot, what I should have elaborated on, and so on and so forth. So they allowed me to do that. So that's what I'm going to try to do. I'm just going to go real quickly over what I see as some key findings in their report. I'm going to try to do it in less than 5 minutes. I'm not the one you want to hear from today. I realize that. So I'm going to go quickly. The one thing that you just got to know about this whole thing first is, okay, what are we studying? So we're studying an intervention that took place in the School District of Philadelphia in 2012-13, whereby the district made big changes to its code of conduct. Most notably, they prohibited the use of out-of-school suspensions for low-level conduct offenses, which is what you just voted on, right? This is failure to follow classroom rules and profanity, things of that nature, okay? And they reduced the length of suspensions for more serious infractions. They did other things besides that. Okay, and we can talk about that, but those are two of the key things that they did. Matthew's study examines the effects of these district-level policy reforms on previously suspended students and also on their peers. And Abby's study, Abby, is it okay? I keep calling you Abby. All right, is more about the disciplinary practices that the district actually is using and how stakeholders perceive them. Okay, very, very different studies. Okay, so the first few slides are from Matthew's study, and I've got to do that too. Whoop, how do I do that? All right, easy enough. So first he finds that all types of out-of-school suspensions were already declining before the policy change took place. So this slide happens to show the conduct OSS, and you see there's the green line of when the policy was introduced, and you'll see beforehand the line was already going down. Okay, and this is the same, we see this pattern across different types of OSS suspensions, all right? Second, just gonna keep this very straightforward. Another thing in that study that he and his co-author found was that less than a quarter of schools fully complied with the ban on low-level conduct suspensions. So we can debate why would that be for reasons we don't fully explore, but less than a quarter of schools actually did what the District of Philadelphia required them to do. Next slide. The number of more serious incidents and the truancy rates increased after the policy change. So in this particular slide, you're just seeing here, for instance, that the policy change led to sustained increases in serious incidents. And again, Matthew's going to be able to have to explain this, what a serious incident is. It's obviously much different than a low-level offense, okay? And it was on the range of increases about 1.3 per 100 students, the increase. All right, cruising along. This is a slide of proficiency and truancy. Again, it shows when the policy occurred, that's the red line, and it found truancy going up and math proficiency going down. But these slides, as Matthew reminded me earlier today, I think are mostly considered correlational. Still, they're curious, right? So we might talk about these. Obviously, it's a curious finding in terms of the trend line. And then, okay, that's the last one for you. And then not on here, because I know I just said he also studied peers, but I didn't want to add another slide because I said I'm not going to go slide crazy. He found negative effects on achievement for peers in certain types of schools. Okay? All right, Abby's study next. Let's see how I do on this one. Her study is 5 chapters, okay, first of all. So I'm not going to do it justice. Most of these findings come from chapter 2, which are in your packet, okay? So she did over 80 interviews with principals and staff, and also a survey to all schools in SDP, which is Philadelphia, in 2016. So this is a few years after this policy change that I just told you about in 2012. And so, you know, we've had a few years to kind of live under this thing, and we surveyed teachers. The survey response was about 57%. Because some people want to know that. All right, one of her key findings was that principals and teachers do not agree on the use of OSS, out of school suspension, in schools. She said, you know, that you'll see the report, she and her colleagues found a big divide between what principals were mostly on board with these changes, and teachers were largely not on board. And here you see in the survey, what do teachers think? And you see largely that a large percentage of teachers are saying that OSS ensures safety, these out-of-school suspensions send the right message about the seriousness of what students have done, and removing disruptive students so that others can learn. They think that that's what OSS helps to do. All right. Next slide. What are the teachers doing? So one of her survey questions was saying, okay, you know, what are your key disciplinary practices in terms of the things that you're doing with kids? You see again that OSS is on here already. It's such tiny print, but I'll let you know that they are using suspensions. OSS about 70-some%. That's sort of in the middle of the heap there. But largely they're saying that they're using parent-teacher conferences. So, you know, basically they're saying we're trying to work with the parents in these parent-teacher conferences to deal and address the discipline issues. Last, she and her colleagues kind of did this profile of schools. They used the survey responses from the survey data, and I mean, she can talk about the methodology. I know we don't, you know, that some of that gets a little bit in the weeds again. But anyway, she's got these 3 categories of types of schools, and most schools fell in this bucket of schools called under-resourced and non-cohesive. And those were schools that were inconsistent in their use of punitive and non-punitive practices, and where teachers felt blamed by administrators for their students' misbehavior. And not on here, because again, you guys have so much in here. She also had some findings around PBS that found that they were poorly implemented. She may have a different way of describing it, but they were not penetrating practices in those schools as they had anticipated that they would be. All right. So that's my summary. Matthew, I'm going to let you go first and tell me, okay, how did I do? What else is worth highlighting? What else do you want to tell people about your study?
And here I thought you were going to be specific in your question. I have to use this. Do I have to use this? So, I mean, I think the first thing is what did the policy do in Philadelphia in 2012-13? As Amber mentioned, the policy targeted 2 specific infractions. So the use of profanity and classroom disruption. In 11-12, which was the year before the policy change, these infractions accounted for something like 25% of all suspensions, right? So there was a decline on average in the use of these infractions or the use of suspensions for these infractions following the policy reform. The issue that, you know, that this work brings up is the extent to which schools that vary in the students that they serve and the populations of students, and likely in their capacity to implement reform, actually implemented the district's mandate to eliminate suspensions for low-level sort of misconduct, right? So what we find is that compliance varied quite dramatically. And so for those schools that never used suspensions for these two misconducts in the 11-12 and 12-13 school years, these were the highest achieving schools in Philadelphia, right? These were the schools that served in a predominantly Black and Hispanic district, about 50% minority students, where the average is about 85%, right? So these were, on average, schools that served a relatively non-minority, higher achieving population in the district. And as you might expect, those schools that didn't comply, that actually increased their use of suspensions, were those that had fewer resources to actually implement the reform. These were schools where the schools were predominantly Black or Hispanic, low achieving, had very high pre-reform suspension rates, right? So I think that, you know, what this issue of compliance brings up is what supports, what resources did Philadelphia provide in addition to changing the statutory limits or the statutory penalties for misconduct, these low-level offenses? And the answer is few to none, right? So effectively what the district required was a removal of suspensions for these low-level infractions without providing any additional resource. And I think what Abby's report will speak to, at least in the years after the reform, is the disconnect between district policy mandates and the provision of additional resources and supports to actually implement reforms at the school, at the local level. So compliance is key to understanding the consequences, both on the implementation side, but also on the outcome side for students in terms of achievement and attendance. Because what we find is that when we compare the change in performance, in academic achievement, in kids who were never suspended, and this is 85% of students in Philadelphia, right? So 15 to 16% of students over this period ever received a suspension, which is about 2 to 3 times the national average of about 6%, right? But still 85% of students in Philadelphia never received suspensions. And we focus our comparison between students who never were suspended in schools that never used suspensions for these two low-level infractions, and students who never received suspensions for low-level infractions in schools that actually increased their use of suspensions, these non-complier schools, right, or the partial complier schools, we see negative effects on achievement. And again, I don't want to claim anything causal here, because there's a lot of sort of causal warrants that are not applicable in the given design, right? Suspensions were not randomly assigned. The district, all students in the district faced this policy reform, but the evidence suggests that, again, those schools that were less able to implement the reform, right? So these are, again, schools serving the most disadvantaged students in an already very disadvantaged district, right, suffered from the under the policy reform. Right. And again, we can think through, and I think the conversation around what could be the potential mechanisms through which we might observe these changes in performance is an important one. Again, I think Abby's work will certainly speak to that. So that's the compliance and sort of some peer effects that we find. So let me stop there.
Okay. All right. One thing that he said, because I'm just trying to parse some of this, right, is that the comparison group was imperfect. Right, Matthew? Would you say that?
Yeah,
so,
no, I think that's
tell
right.
them again, because I'm not sure if they got that. What the comparison group was, and kind of why it had to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, ideally, what would we like to see? We'd like to see a situation where we randomly assign suspensions in certain school settings and look at the consequences before and after on students never suspended and students who receive suspensions. Right, and clearly that's not only infeasible but impractical from an equity perspective, right? So what we tried to do is say, look, what is the most reasonable set of schools to compare the changes in student achievement over time? Those would be schools that never used suspensions for these two policy infractions that were not subject, at least in principle, to suspensions following the policy reform, right? So we're comparing before and after the policy change, suspensions, or rather achievement and absences among students who never received suspensions in schools that never suspended kids for these low-level infractions, to schools that varied in their level of compliance with the district policy, right? So again, there are concerns that these schools look very different on unobservable characteristics, particularly around their capacity to implement district-level reforms that may be related to the outcomes that we're measuring. So again, the causal warrant applies here that, again, this is strong correlational evidence, but it doesn't suggest that district level reforms have a negative causal effect on peers, right? So again, I think that that's something to be aware of when thinking about how these results may apply to other districts, other settings that may be considering removing suspensions for these low level infractions.
Right, helpful. Abby, tell me what was the gist of your study, and maybe elaborate on some of the things in the slides.
Sure. First of all, just a couple points about context, just adding to what both Amber and Matthew have said about what was going on in Philadelphia. So yes, there were two types of infractions, nonviolent infractions that were targeted, just as Matthew mentioned. However, there was also increased messaging going on from the district to principals, both implicitly and explicitly, about the fact that they wanted to see a decrease in suspension overall. There were new positions created within the district that were focused on climate at around that time, and there was outreach from those folks to principals, but most of this communication was being filtered to principals, not necessarily to teachers. Another piece, well, I agree, as this conversation evolves, I think you'll see that Matthew and I agree on one fundamental point, which is, we agree on many points, but one fundamental agreement is that there was inadequate support for the implementation of some of the climate measures that might have helped this policy take hold in more schools. However, I think it's inaccurate to say that the supports were not provided. The district began at that same time phasing in the implementation of a number of climate improvement measures, including positive behavioral interventions and supports, or PBIS, which many of you may be familiar with. So they began phasing it in slowly. It was a small cohort initially. Now they're up to about 40 to 50 schools that receive training provided by the district through various grant sources for this approach. And these are in K through 5 and K through 8 schools, which were the subject of the study that my team worked on. So that's an important piece of the context. The district has also worked to build their ability to provide trauma-informed training to teachers and staff in schools. They have a staff of folks who now provide that, and those folks report that their phones are ringing off the hooks from schools who want that kind of support. There's certainly not enough available to provide those kinds of supports for schools. So I think that's an important piece of context. As far as my study, everything that you put up there was certainly accurate, but I would change the emphasis to some extent. The key takeaways from the study that my team worked on were that, first of all, we identified 3 different types or profiles of schools in Philadelphia based on their climate. And when I say climate, I'm referring to the learning and working conditions for both staff and students in the school. I'm not talking about the temperature. Sometimes people think that. So both in terms of climate and disciplinary practices in those schools. So we surveyed, in collaboration with the district, we surveyed staff, teachers, and principals in schools, and we were able to use a method called latent class analysis to identify 3 different types or profiles of schools. And what we found was that there are differences in student outcomes based on those 3 profiles. So, and in particular, we found that membership in one of the profiles, when Amber had that up there before, she showed the breakdown. But one of the profiles which we identified, or we called the collaborative and relational profile, the students who attended schools in that profile were achieved higher. They score better on state tests in math, in reading, and in science, and they have fewer suspensions. And in those schools are really characterized by, in their disciplinary policy, an emphasis on strong relationships among staff and students, on collaborative decision-making, and they rely far less than in the schools in the other 2 profiles on harsh disciplinary or exclusionary disciplinary practices. So there are different types of schools in Philadelphia, and we see that and I'm also, this is not a causal study, it's an exploratory study, and we are not claiming that those types emerged in response to the change in the district policy. Many of those schools have been well on their way to that prior to this. However, what's interesting is that those schools in that 3rd profile, that collaborative and relational profile, are the ones that have embraced the spirit of what the district is attempting to achieve. And in those schools, we see better outcomes.
Can I just jump in very quickly? I think the time frame here is also important to distinguish. So our analysis covers the 2005-06 through 14-15 school years, which predates your analysis, which is for the 16-17 year, right? And at least, and I agree with Abby to some extent that yes, in principle, there are a handful of schools that were starting to implement some form of restorative practices, but certainly in conversation with folks who run school safety in the district, they communicated to us that, look, we didn't provide any additional resources to schools specifically to implement this reform. So I think understanding that context is clearly important for understanding the variability in compliance that emerges following the reform.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I also wanted to address one other aspect that you highlighted from the study, and that is the issue of the teacher views on suspension. So yes, another part of our study, another focus of our study was to try to identify what are the barriers essentially to helping more of the schools look like the schools that are in that third profile that has the best outcomes. And one of the barriers that arose was that for many teachers, who we have to remember have been for 25 years instructed that the way to handle misbehavior is to use harsh discipline and suspension, that we have to remember that that is sort of we have a whole generation of teachers who have been instructed to do that. So without providing them with the level of supports, as Matthew suggests, that we may have seen in some of those profile 3 schools, we are asking for a very big shift, and many of the teachers are not there. And we did identify that as a key barrier and something that needs to be addressed in terms of moving forward with any climate improvement projects.
And I know that you have a list of questions, but just to get this, because I know that this emerged in our conversation last week or the week before. So when we're talking about suspensions and we're talking about PBIS or restorative practices, I think it's important to recognize the distinction as one being sort of a punitive response to misconduct, that being suspensions, and PBIS and restorative practices being a response to student behavioral patterns, right? And I think that that's an important distinction, because often the conversation is, well, are we going to replace suspensions with PBIS, or we're going to replace suspensions with restorative practices? And my view is always, suspensions for certain infractions may be necessary. There is emerging evidence, and we've got some other work from Philadelphia that shows that suspending kids for these low-level infractions has a negative effect, and I'm speaking more causally in the sense on student achievement. But again, to Abby's point, thinking about the level of support to implement PBIS and restorative justice is not just let's implement a policy or a practice in a school, but it requires, and again, Abby can speak to this more than I can, specifically about the extent to which resources are required to do that. So again, I think the conversation tends to get mixed up between let's replace suspensions with these practices, when the practices are actually targeting things that preface, if you will, any consequences for student misconduct.
Right. I think the theory behind PBIS, just to add to what you're saying, is essentially that it's a way of interacting with students and creating a school climate where students are less likely to misbehave, where they're incentivized to get on board with school-wide expectations as far as behavior and interactions between students and staff. And there's a significant body of research, I know we'll get to this, that can attest to the effectiveness of that approach.
All right, so I'm going to put my former teacher hat on. I'm also on a charter school board in Ward 8, and I was worked in a school very similar to the schools in Philadelphia in my first iteration. These findings about teachers are compelling. They're not, they're unequivocal in Philadelphia on the survey on how they feel about these suspensions. And we'll get to this as another question. You guys know there's been school climate research, and this is correlational. Almost all of this stuff is correlational. There's very few, and Matthew, I'll ask you about this soon, very few rigorous studies that we would claim can show causal impacts. But what we're seeing, for instance, in New York City, are that the perceptions of school climate have deteriorated since the district revised its policies to require that OSS be approved by the central office. That's one correlational study. And then there's one in Chicago. I can't remember if this was your study or not, Matthew, maybe.
So I worked on that, and we've got some other ones.
All right, that showed that reducing the length of suspensions through district policy led to a decline in student-teacher perceptions of school climate. So I guess, and I'm just going to talk from an individual teacher, when you're in some of these schools that are exceedingly difficult schools, and oh, by the way, you're teaching there because you want to. You want to, right? Like this is where you feel like is your calling. And these teachers are reporting that they feel They feel like they aren't being supported when they have these kids in their classrooms. They feel like they are being blamed in many cases for the student's behavior. They feel like, the administrator doesn't have my back. So I guess what I'm saying is it a matter, and just talk from especially you, Abby, because you had so much experience with the teachers and interviewing them. Is it a matter, in your opinion, that it's the implementation? It's just the implementation. Can't we get the implementation right of whatever we're trying to do? Or is it that it's the policy, right? There's the policy to blame. Like, should there be a district ban? Does that automatically set up a feeling that teachers feel like my hands are tied already because I'm being told what to do? And they're not in my classroom, by the way. We always hear like teachers that rightfully so say, why don't these policymakers spend a day in my class, right? So there's some of that going on. So I guess I'm asking you, do you think that it's the policy, the implementation, or both that there's the reason that these teachers are feeling the way that they are?
I think, and this is from certainly my perspective as a researcher, but also I was a teacher in Philadelphia. I think that a policy change needs to be accompanied by the kinds of supports for implementation that make it possible for teachers.
Okay, but is the policy worth doing without it? Is the policy worth doing without it? If you're not going to do all that you can to support these teachers, should that policy be implemented? This is the hard question I said to both of you guys I was going to ask you on this panel.
I'm a policy researcher. I believe that policy matters. I believe that we had 25 years of a very bad policy and that we look up now and we know the harms of that policy on students. I believe that we need to undo that policy.
Which policy? Sorry, Abby.
Zero tolerance policies that have led to incontrovertible findings about the harms of suspension.
But so now we've got a different policy.
Yes.
Now it's called ban suspensions for certain types of offenses.
Right.
So are we saying, but this is the policy that you think should be implemented, even if we can't do the supports? Or are you saying that we should?
Both and. I know you want me to give a simple answer, but it's a both and.
Okay.
We need to change the policy and we need to provide the supports. And we, as a society, as educators, as people who are concerned with schools and studying schools, need to push for that. We know what kinds of programs can help schools become the kinds of places that help children grow instead of kicking them out and giving them poor life outcomes.
All right.
We know how to do it.
Fair enough.
Let me push back on Abby a little bit. So it's up until very recently, I would argue it's not incontrovertible, because that suggests that in the absence of a suspension, if we think about what the counterfactual would be, what would the student's outcome have been? Which is a causal question, right? So I agree with you that there has been 20 years of studies that show that students who receive suspensions on average have worse outcomes. But I'll push back a little bit to suggest that there was no strong evidence to suggest that those students' outcomes would have been different in the absence of the suspension, right?
I agree that that has been a criticism, and I also believe that the research based on that has changed. I wonder if you saw Rosenbaum's piece last week.
So I can
Push it.
Just closer.
I can tell you that we've got work from Philadelphia that now convinces me. Joanna Laco and I have just finished this paper, which uses the policy change to estimate the direct effect of suspension on student outcomes. And we find that not only for low-level offenses, but also for more serious offenses, there is a negative effect on student achievement. But we find, though, it's modest relative to what's been found in other studies. So, for example, others have found that receiving a suspension has an effect on the order of, and I'm going to say standard deviations, just to put it in scale, of 0.3 to 0.35 standard deviations. You don't need to know what that means, because I'm going to tell you that what we're finding is the effect is more like 0.04, right? So yes, it's not good for students, but it's not nearly as bad as we would think for the reasons that I've just suggested, which is the students that are more likely to receive suspensions are those that also systematically are more likely to do worse on student achievement, right? But again, the point being is that on the one hand, yes, I think that there is a large correlational body of evidence that suggests this is not a good practice. And I think that the more recent evidence that leverages policy changes to try to get at the direct effect of suspension is also suggesting the same, but in a more modest way, right? And again, but I will echo what Abby said in response to your question, that first, not every policy change is the same. So when we talk about discipline policy reform, it's not uniform across districts or states. So for example, we talked about what happened in Philadelphia in 2012-13. And Amber, you mentioned Chicago, and I've done work on Chicago's policy reform, which did something quite different. It didn't eliminate suspensions. It reduced the statutory minimum days suspension for more serious misconduct, right? So not only is it a different response in terms of not eliminating suspensions, but reducing the days, but it also targets a very different margin of suspensions on the more serious end, right? So on the one hand, I think we need to think very clearly about what is the policy reform, and then yes, to Abby's point, what is the district or school level response in terms of the additional supports, given that we know that bringing students who have misbehavior, have behavioral issues back into the classroom is likely to have some negative spillovers onto the majority of kids who don't. Right, so again, that's an important consideration. A, we know that suspensions are not good for students who receive them. There's evidence that they're also not particularly good for students who don't. There's evidence that in schools that suspend more kids, students on average do worse who are not suspended. But again, that also suggests that targeting these suspensions and eliminating them as a reform cannot stand alone as a policy response to try to improve both behavior and outcomes for kids in schools.
All right, so a couple of things that I heard you say. One is that even when we have the most rigorous studies, the changes, the differences that we see and the effects that we're able to estimate are pretty small. I see one head nodding in affirmation and one head disagreeing.
About immediate effects.
Yes.
But we have a significant, so just last week, I'm gonna highlight
Right,
one
but
study.
make clear that it's correlational because I
It's
get
not a
this,
correlation
I know we're on two tiers of
It's not.
studies. Okay, great.
So just this past week, Janet Rosenbaum, who's an epidemiologist and biostatistician, released a study using the AdHealth database, which is a large database. She followed a cohort of students from their school years, and then again checking in with collecting data from them when they were in their about 25 and then in their early 30s.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a really unprecedented study because it addressed the exact shortcoming that you're alluding to and that Matthew also addressed. So this was a matched group. She used a matched group of students. They were matched on 60 different variables, including pre-suspension behavior, delinquency records, familial characteristics such as poverty, exposure to violence, psychological traits like their impulsiveness, which is a known predictor of many of negative outcomes. So these are kids that were on exactly the same path before suspension. 10 years later, the kids who were suspended, we're talking about 10,000 kids. This is not a small study. The kids who were suspended, 8% more likely to drop out of high school, 40% more likely to have been arrested. Among the subgroup of Black students, 94% less likely to have received a bachelor's degree. And the same outcomes bear out a few years later when they're in their early 30s. We can no longer say that there isn't good evidence for the long-term harms of suspension.
So as an economist, I'll push back again on that.
I was going to ask you what you thought of that study, Matthew.
Match studies are great because, as Abby described, they allow us to compare kids that look the same on observable characteristics. And I think it's important because we know that pre-measures of misconduct or suspensions are highly correlated with
Talk
later
English,
outcomes.
Matthew, talk English. All right?
Right?
Okay.
But the concern is that what about those things we don't observe about kids? What about things that may be latent? Things like ability, motivation,
You should look at the list of controls
I
or matching characteristics.
That's fair, but again, I think that we need to be very sort of clear-eyed about what the limitations are if we're going to make the types of policy decisions given what you're suggesting, right? Which, again, my concern is always that there are things that we don't observe about kids, right, that may be correlated with their likelihood of suspension that at the same time are correlated with their later life outcomes. So yes, I agree with you that matched studies are improvements over the existing correlational evidence. And I agree with you that at the same time that do we want to wait for the perfect randomized study to make policy decisions? Maybe or maybe not, depending on what the policy decision is going to be. But I think we need to make it very clear that if we're making policy decisions based on evidence that's not strictly causal, we shouldn't necessarily expect the same outcomes to be observed.
Yes, I agree. I would really encourage you to look at this study, however, because this was a quasi-experiment with baseline equivalence. This study would have met the evidence standards for causal inference for any of 100 federal agencies. So take a look at that, and we'll talk about it over
All right.
years.
You guys see how I started this by saying this is really hard to read the body of research and come away with firm conclusions. So I did not lie about that. I'm going to move on because I don't, we could argue about research studies all day, right? But one other question, I don't have a ton more time, but I'm going to, I'm not on Twitter, but I know there's lots of discussion. My colleague, Mike Petrilli, has been observing that one reason we likely see differences in suspensions, and he's been putting this on the blog, and it's stirred quite a bit of debate around the blogosphere, is that we're seeing differences in student behavior. Okay, so in other words, there's even been some studies that have shown that some students even report the differences themselves. So they'll say, for example, I get into more fights, or I show up late for class. And you can actually see some students saying, you know what, I'm going to fess up that I'm also doing more of these behaviors that are linked to higher suspensions. So we also hear folks say, you know what, aren't these differences linked to socioeconomic factors like poverty, exposure to trauma, and so on and so forth? So I guess I want to ask the panelists here, do you think that one reason we're seeing these differences in suspension is because we're seeing differences in student behavior that are linked to some of these other socioeconomic things that we know may be happening in these kids' lives? And if so, does that observation hold water relative to the research?
So, I mean, I think anyone in the room would agree that if students, and the evidence suggests this, at least the developmental psychology evidence, that if students are exposed to early life trauma, right, that has an effect on their brain development and it has an effect on their behavior. And when we segregate kids into schools, particularly in urban communities, that disproportionately are exposed to early life trauma, then we're likely to observe differences in behavior that may manifest themselves in differences in consequences as measured by suspensions. What we'd like to see, and we're starting to see evidence from places like Louisiana, which has really rich student level data, is comparing situations where two students who vary, for example, only on race, but are involved in a fight, the same fight, what the consequences are. Right, and there is some evidence now from Louisiana, from folks at the New Orleans Research Alliance, that have found that there are some very, very modest, but some differences in the consequences and penalties that Black students receive for fighting when fighting with a white student. Very, very modest. So again, we can argue about whether this is a meaningful difference or not. But again, as we get better data, and for those of you who are out there that have the data or are willing to sort of provide it for these types of studies, I encourage you to do so, because this is the only way that we're going to arrive at the type of answers and policy solutions in light of the many issues that we've sort of brought up around sort of trying to make causal inference from observational data. But so again, the concern is that, yes, we are clustering and segregating students into schools where there is a disproportionate exposure among these students. So there's not just to trauma. So there's not just an immediate effect on their own behavior, but there's also some sort of dynamic interaction between their behavior and other students who are similarly exposed. And that's a concern.
Let me ask you, I'll ask my own in the weeds question, because I don't know the study as close as you do, but were they able to control for prior infractions?
Yeah.
They were able to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So the question is, because sometimes these studies aren't able to control for that. So it means if you can't control for it, maybe the kid that just got in worse trouble than the other kid for the same thing, this is his 10th time doing this. And if you're a classroom teacher, you know that you want a heavier penalty meted out to the kid that's on his 10th time doing this than if it's his first time. So that was my question, is whether they were able to control for that type of thing, and they were. Time, how am I doing time, Karen? 5 minutes. Okay. You want me to take a quick question from or rather me not do that? It's up to me. All right, let me ask if there's one burning question before I've got a long list. I can keep going. But I'd like to see if there's one burning from you guys before in our last 5 minutes on this panel. All right, I see a burning question. Oh, okay. Yes, ma'am.
Hold on.
We're going to bring you a microphone here.
Thank you. It's actually a very quick question, which is I would love if you all could send out to all the participants the information on that study that you were just citing. That's the recent one with the great comparison groups with controlling all the factors. Can that be sent out to everybody?
Sure.
The Louisiana study.
No, the one that you were talking about, the Rosenthal study.
Yes, I can.
Yeah,
provide
a
it.
quick question.
Actually, both would be great.
It's 2018. Janet Rosenbaum.
Okay.
But I can-
Rosenbaum.
Yeah,
Okay.
PAUM. But
Okay.
I can send you the link and maybe
Awesome.
Karen can make it available.
One other quick one? Yes, ma'am.
It may not be so clear. Is there any attempt made to find out the family situation of these students that are disruptive and getting large number of suspensions? Like, do these kids have enough to eat at home? Are they suffering from child abuse? Is there a broken marriage? They have a single parent who doesn't have enough attention given to them because they're working too much and not able to be there for them.
In a way to tailor supports, is that what you mean?
Pardon me?
In a way to tailor the intervention that they do need instead of a suspension?
You know, school might be the most stable place they have, but they act out because they come from an environment that's an acting out
Right.
environment at home
That's right.
by either the parents or the other siblings.
So I guess I'm gonna angle our question a little bit differently because it actually ties into something we didn't have time to discuss yet, which is what evidence do we have about some of these other programs that attempt to address some of these things that these kids are dealing with at home, and whether it be PBIS or whatnot. Is there something you guys can add to that?
There's a strong evidence base, both sort of associational evidence, but then more recently, very strong experimental evidence that shows that PBIS I'm talking about specifically, there are other approaches that are less well studied. For instance, restorative practices is sort of an up and coming one, but it has less of a research base. But the PBIS approach certainly focuses on attending to individual needs of students, particularly like tier 2. So once schools have sort of proactively addressed most of the behavior, then kids who are still continuing to struggle with their behavior beyond that receive more targeted interventions and supports. So yes, there's a significant evidence base from randomized control trials, large ones, that shows significant decreases in aggressive behavior, office disciplinary referrals, suspensions, increases in emotional regulation and pro-social behavior, things like that in schools that are effectively implementing PBIS.
There also sometimes is a correlation on the number of counselors there are in the elementary schools or the middle and high schools. We have a tendency in the education community to cut back on that because of costs. They usually have master's degrees and so forth. And I think that's a factor that needs to be observed too.
Great. Hey, you guys, join me in thanking my two panelists here. And we are doing a quick shift change here. Next group.
Thanks, Amber.
Thank you, guys.
A lot to discuss.
Lots.
Keep that up very
Did you keep your
nicely.
lapel? Okay. Just make sure you turn it on. Oh.
That was good.
Sorry. No, you're fine. You're fine. It's already on. Which way? I'll send this to you.
All right.
Excellent.
I'm a little bummed I have to stop tweeting now because I was sort of.
I haven't yet perfected it.
I might keep doing it. If Aaliyah doesn't let me talk, I might just take the clip.
I get too embarrassed if I just can't do it yet.
Yeah.
I haven't perfected the art.
Alrighty, well, thanks everyone for being here and for staying for the second part of this event. When I was listening to the first panel, I was reflecting on just how many reports people have been sending me in the past few days after Fordham started promoting this on Twitter. People are bombarding me, or that sounds like I didn't appreciate it. They're flooding me with research, and you know, not necessarily because of the merits of the research, but although that's obviously a point of debate, but just because of the sheer amount of research and the number of studies that have been done on this, I was thinking that it actually makes it a lot more difficult for me to really arrive at clear answers around this debate. It's just, it only seems to entrench people on opposite sides of the debate further in their views, and it just becomes so polemical. So I'm excited to chat with the people beside me today and hopefully kind of advance the dialogue behind or beyond the sort of typical sticking points and really get a sense of how we can move forward and come up with policies that actually work. So I'll start by introducing the panelists. On my far left is Kristen Harper. She is the Director of Policy Development at Child Trends, right? Yeah. And then Laura Jimenez, she is the Director for Standards and Accountability for the Center of American Progress. Then to my right, we have Cami Anderson. She's the founder of Third Way and Third Way Solutions and the Discipline Revolution Project. And then, of course, last but not least, Michael Petrilli, the president of this institution. So
Tell us about who you are.
Oh, yes. I'm Aaliyah Wong. I'm the education editor and writer at The Atlantic. I've been covering this for, well, as long as I've been there, for the past 3 years, and like I said, it's just become harder and harder to cover. So as a starting point, I wanted to have you all imagine sort of a hypothetical world in which sort of all schools really were able to create this ideal climate where all the students were just so engaged, so excited about learning, had strong relationships with each other, with their teachers, that sort of, you know, debates about discipline are kind of moot. Like we don't really even have to be having this debate. So if you could picture this hypothetical school, I want you guys to sort of describe for us in the most tangible terms possible what that school looks like, what is happening at that school that they're able to achieve this climate. And anyone can start.
I'd love to jump in because I'm lucky enough to be able to not do it hypothetically. I've spent the last couple of years, you know, working deeply with individual schools and systems of schools, both charter and district, that are really actively shifting away from exclusionary discipline practices through a host of things. So, by the way, shout out to all the teachers, students, you know, principals, superintendents, charter leaders. You know, we're here at Fordham, and we have the luxury of sort of, you know, calling shots from the balcony a bit. So I just wanted to acknowledge, and I'll do my best to sort of channel my sort of passionate practitioner self up here, but it's no substitute for the folks out there doing the hard work every day. So anyway, what we found sort of out there where folks have come to a realization that the exclusionary discipline policies, much like we heard, are just far too costly. I mean, I think there's actually a ton of evidence that that's the case. I don't think that's in dispute. And so people are realizing this, they're moving away from it, and there are lots of folks who've done it very well, right? So they tend to do 3 things proactively and 2 things reactively. The 3 things they do proactively are, number 1, they have a really awesome teaching, right? The best like behavior management system is rigorous content that's relevant, that also reflects the cultures of our students, right? So when a kid sees themselves in the content and they're busy doing really meaningful work, they're much more likely to be on task and doing stuff they're supposed to be doing. So that's number 1, and there's a big focus on that. So I sort of reject the notion that discipline reform is sort of anti-rigor, right? It's the opposite of my point of view. That's kind of number 1. Number 2, they invest heavily in relationships. We heard this earlier, between students and teachers. There's trust building. There's high expectations and high support around not just academics, but also behavior, which means that you would never say to a kid, why can't you just learn how to self-regulate? The way that you would say, why can't you just learn algebra, right? There's a mindset that it's the adult's responsibility to keep coaching and trying different strategies, and until those young people gain the competencies and skills around the social and emotional piece alongside the academic. And frankly, a mindset and belief that it's possible, it's doable, and it's their job to keep trying until it happens, right? The third thing they do is they have systems, right? Lots of systems, response to intervention and ways of escalating if kids need proactive support and noticing young people before the point of impact, and all these they treat young people as individuals, and they have systems and supports for teachers as well to kind of process what they're going through, because it's hard when you get challenged by a not so little person or a very, very little person, she says, with a 7-year-old. So they do those 3 things very proactively. And then they also prepare for the inevitable moment when a young person pushes back, right? Like this is part of growing up. You're supposed to challenge authority. That's your job. And so they respond in a developmentally appropriate way. And that includes things like restorative practices and the ability to repair trust. Restorative practices is not anti-consequences, right? They're pro figuring out how a kid can own up to what they've done. And in fact, the accountability that comes with that, it turns out is much more meaningful than sort of that comes with shame and punishment. So they respond developmentally appropriately to the individual kid, and they hold the young person accountable for their behavior in ways that makes them learn and grow, which generally the least effective way to do that is to put a kid out. So those are the three things they do proactively, the two things they do reactively, and they don't necessarily think that if they do everything right on the front end, there's going to be no challenges, right? They sort of, it's like in your marriage, you don't sort of think about how to fight fair, at the point of which you're arguing, right? They sort of do all the great stuff on the front end, and then they prepare in a very thoughtful and meaningful way on the back end for how to handle incidents and use them as an opportunity for accountability and growth, as opposed to shame and exclusion.
We've obviously thought a lot about this. Anyone else have anything to add to this picture?
That was magical. I loved it. And for me, what Cammie just shared, what it boils down to is that the schools that are able to do this create an empowering narrative, right? They create a vision of what they want to be, and then they put the systems in place that allow them to take the actions they need to take to realize that vision.
That's a great way to put it.
And just add another point. These schools think about ways to support their teachers in doing all of the amazing things that Cammie just described. I mean, the truth of the matter is we have teachers that are coming into classrooms, coming from preparatory programs that don't address child development adequately, that provide almost nothing in the curriculum about classroom management. And so schools that do a good job manage to compensate for that and find ways to provide that coaching that teachers need in order to build those relationships with students, to find ways to clarify early behavioral expectations, and all of those little things that just one after another really do help you create a climate where children are both safe and where learning is able to take place.
Yeah, and I think Cammie said it really well, and I think this is where there is a lot of agreement, is on the vision of what we would like schools to be. Look, I'm going to have plenty of time to be provocative later, but to be a little bit provocative, let me say, I do think there are schools out there like Success Academy, the real Success Academy, not how it's caricatured by some people in the media, where it looks very much like what Cammie just described. I mean, engaging learning and great teachers and a respectful environment, all that stuff. But they also sometimes use something like out-of-school suspensions as a tool, especially early in the school year, to send a message to the parent, especially that, hey, this behavior, we are serious about having high expectations here. That means academics, it also means behavior. And, what your child did is not okay. And that they find that works for them, that they end up getting kids to then, buy into the school culture, and that it can work. So I just to say that I think we share, I think mostly share common vision, but we should be also open to the idea, especially those of us that support things like school choice, that there's going to look somewhat different in different places. I should also just really quickly say, just so people that don't know people's backgrounds in terms of what they used to do, just so you know, Cammie was a superintendent in Newark, and also oversaw the school district in New York City that, how does it get described? I'm going to butcher if I get it wrong.
It included the 30, 60, 90-day suspension centers, the one-year suspension centers, the schools on Rikers Island, the schools for students who are in juvenile justice centers. I don't need a study to tell me that the same kids were everywhere and that they did not reflect the racial makeup of the city, right? And so
I don't need a study to tell me that is a much harder job than leading an education policy think tank. Wow, that sounds...
90,000 students in New York City, which was, by the way, double the size of New York.
Oh my God. And then Kristen and Laura were both in the Obama administration working on the 2014 policy, among other things. Kristen was very much involved there too. So anyways, just so people know everybody's background.
Thanks for that. You broke my rule because we were imagining a world in which we didn't even have to talk about discipline.
Yes.
But now, okay, let's...
you can give me a suspension.
Okay, yes, you're suspended. Now we're going to jump back into reality and sort of think about these. Obviously, there are schools who have been able to reform their discipline policies and have managed to reduce racial disparities and move away from zero tolerance discipline, and also avoid sort of creating the kind of lawless campuses that some people have described as happening in the aftermath of discipline reform. So if you were to go to the schools that were not as successful, that have not seemed to get these reforms right, that are struggling in one way, shape, or form, whether it's because they aren't able to manage classrooms well, or because teachers are fudging the statistics, which we've heard about, we've heard evidence of that happening, or they're either just moving away from maybe less punitive forms of discipline to other forms of discipline, which ultimately isn't really doing much. So if you were to visit these schools that are struggling, what sorts of things would you look for in your effort to sort of troubleshoot what's going on and come up with a solution? What would you look for on campus? What are some common sorts of what are some common examples of problems?
So I think the first thing I would say in response to this is how we talk about our children matters, and to say lawless, I think, creates a disempowering narrative. So that's not a term that I will use when talking about children. But putting that aside, yes, there are places certainly where reforms haven't gone well. I think we've seen, in the testing and accountability arena, something similar happened as we implemented new standards, which were, I think we would all agree, the right thing to do. There weren't necessarily the supports that were needed at the local level to make sure that the implementation went well. But I don't think that any of us would say that the standards were the wrong thing to do and we should throw them out, right? I think the same is true in this discussion, in discipline reform. We've heard a few times that the zero tolerance policies are pretty harmful to kids. And so going back to that, I don't think is a very good option. So we really need to move forward. I think what we kind of heard underneath the surface in the previous panel is, folks may not necessarily be bought in when a new change comes down from wherever it comes from. And so getting people on board with what the vision is, I think, is a very critical first step. Understanding your data and your context, I think, is another very, very critical step. So who's getting suspended, why, how often, for how long, who refers them, getting really clear on your own context discipline data. And making clear that zero tolerance is just very harmful for kids, right? We've heard that achievement goes down for kids who are suspended as well as their peers, and so that's very concerning. But I think the critical step is getting everyone on the same page about what needs to happen, and getting everyone involved in that discussion that is in the school building, because all of the adults in the building have to be part of the solution. It can't just be put on the backs of teachers, right? We also heard that kids are coming to school with issues, right? And they might need some mental health supports, that perhaps teachers aren't the most appropriate people to provide those types of supports. So we've got to think about, how can we better support our teachers so that they can provide what they need to within the classroom, but what can the other adults in the school building also provide to kind of create that positive climate we want to see?
Just operating in silos, not having
Correct.
those
It's a community.
So just quick myth buster for a second. I think there is a misperception that schools that may feel emotionally and physically unsafe, and I think when we talk about safety, we have to talk about both emotional safety and physical safety, that those schools are the ones that sort of lack exclusionary discipline policies. And I think we heard a little bit of this in the first panel, but that's not the case, right? So I can tell you that when I first became superintendent in Newark and in many of my programs in New York City, some of the schools that were the most sort of top down and in your mind what you would think of as not just zero tolerance, but we're going to send a message to families and students, and we have high behavioral expectations, were the most physically and emotionally unsafe feeling that I ever walked the halls of. And that is in large part because of the 5 things that I said schools that are doing the opposite are doing. They weren't doing all those other things, right? This is sort of goes to the earlier panel, the one that were collaborative and relational were actually more safe. So I just feel like first, we just need to get clear on that. There are schools that feel physically and emotionally unsafe, and a lot of those schools are actually case studies of exclusionary discipline practices. And so we can debate cause and effect, but like, that's the case, right? So in order to move away from that, we need to move closer to the 5 things I was talking about in terms of all of the inputs we do with young people on the front end, and then how we respond in developmentally and smart ways when infractions occur. I do think that, sort of leading with policy and not with capacity building has its issues, but so does the status quo, right? So it's sort of like, we need to build capacity. We also need to align policy with our values. And so I just have to say, like, it sort of frustrates, it's incredible to me, given the amount of time I've spent in schools, that somehow we think like sort of top-down exclusionary policies equal physical and emotional safety. That's just not my experience. We heard that really isn't ferreted out in the data. It definitely isn't ferreted out in my experience. So I think we need to be real about that, because how we diagnose the challenges or how we do the solutions. And I want to support, we need to be very careful in how we talk about criminalizing young people's behavior, because if we think of it that way, that's how our response is going to be. Like, we're in the educating business. We're supposed to be building capacity of young people, teaching them self-regulation skills, helping them to be metacognitive, right? Responding in ways that are developmentally appropriate. Criminalizing it is not going to help. And that my supposition is that's why we see these long-term longitudinal studies, sort of ferreting out. Once you've been criminalized, it's hard to come back from that. And we do it all the time, in particular to students of color, in particular to students with disabilities, in particular to LGBTQ youth. And that is, in my estimation, the case for action. And of course, it needs to be accompanied with capacity.
Yeah, if I can get in on some of this. First of all, where we agree. Absolutely. If you look at a high school or a middle school that is suspending tons of kids, I would agree that is an indicator that there's something going on very wrong at that school, right? That school is most likely walking to is going to be out of control, probably doesn't have very good leadership, is a problem. These suspension factories, it's a problem. And the studies from Arkansas and other places have been showing that when you dig in below the district data, which, OCR hasn't been able to do, but now when you can go in, what you see are these huge discrepancies between schools. I mean, it really is a school by school issue in most places. And these are, places that need help fast. What I would say about those schools, though, is as bad as they are doing whatever they're doing, if all you do is now say, keep everything else the same, but you can't suspend kids. That's a disaster. And that's where people like Max Eden and myself and others in this debate are coming from. That, when we're just very worried that, some of it's anecdotal. It's starting to be a little more what you might call evidence when you look at school climate surveys and the like. And some of this evidence from Philly and other places is that this is not going well, because we did lead with the policy and not the supports. And because these are dysfunctional schools, oftentimes in dysfunctional systems, as bad as we are about addressing low academic performance in these kinds of schools, we're even worse at knowing how the heck to fix what's going on with the school climate thing. So I would, so I just think that, the ideal world, and I'm glad we started with that, is to nip all this in the bud and have great teaching and have great learning, The problem is a lot of schools aren't like that. And so how do we get from here to there? And we are not providing supports. And so it could get, with a very big worry that things are getting unsafe, things are getting disorderly. And the only thing that I just want to beg all of us to do, you were right to call out the lawlessness piece and the criminalization, but we have got to make sure that the kids who are not misbehaving are as much in our minds as the kids who are. And that has not been a part of this conversation. That the vast majority of kids who themselves are poor kids and kids of color are coming to school trying to learn. And I thought the education reform movement was about helping them learn, closing achievement gaps, helping them go on to have success, upward mobility, right? And I feel like we've gotten somewhat distracted because a small subset of kids is disruptive, and we're trying to figure out how to better suit their needs, but we're forgetting all these other kids. And guess what? You go into affluent schools, you don't see the kind of disorder that we're talking about. But for poor kids, we say, well, sorry, you got to deal with that disruptive classmate. But that's what equity demands. So that's where we start to have some real breakdowns. There's huge evidence that having a single disruptive kid in a classroom can have incredible negative effects in terms of achievement. And so we got to pay attention to that piece too.
So Cami, I know you're going to want to respond to this because we were talking the other day, and you.
Here we go. Roll out the beer cart, people. Where's the beer? Come on.
I mean, I would just want to start by saying I don't think anybody up in this panel would support the idea that there should be policy change without the implementation supports. Again, we are asking teachers, and again, when we're looking at the schools that are operating with the least resources possible, you're talking about schools with very high percentages of first and second year teachers. So what they didn't get in preparatory programs, they also haven't had the opportunity to get, working in the schools and picking up those skills as they've gone along. So that needs to be addressed, along with taking time to actually pull people around the table, pull your teachers, pull your counselors, pull your students, pull your parents around a table, and begin having the difficult conversations about what it is we want to achieve with respect to the school. What does justice mean after a student does engage in an act of misbehavior? Does justice mean punishment, or does justice mean we find ways for the child to take it to feel accountable for what they've done and resolve not to do it again? What are we after? And if we can get to that second option without the use of suspension, how do we get there? Also, man, Mike, you ran through a lot of different points. But thinking through, when we have those conversations, when we try to inspire that kind of culture change, when we provide those supports, we do need to think more about how we time the implementation component with the policy shifts. For a school that's struggling with a particular type of policy, such as a ban on nonviolent offenses, I would take another look at the policy. Luckily, we have school districts across the country implementing this in a whole bunch of different ways. We have school districts saying, we're not going to suspend out of school, kids that have not gotten to third grade yet. If you are a young student engaging in particular kind of behaviors, we're not suspending you out of school. If you are any age child, where some districts such as Pennsylvania went further, saying, these two types of behaviors, classroom disruption, willful defiance in LA, we're not going to suspend for those types at all. You have so many myriad ways in which districts have gone about this. We still have a lot to learn about which variations are hard for schools to implement and which are a little easier. For a school that has tried to take a bigger bite to jump with, I would suggest, perhaps scale back a little bit. Maybe you start, if you're talking at a district level, perhaps you start with your younger populations, and that gives the district a chance to really focus some intensive supports and training and coaching on the teachers in those schools, and gradually scale up. But I think there's a lot of different things that we can do, and a lot of different things we can learn from what districts are already doing before we abandon the idea that, well, maybe we just shouldn't do this after all because implementation is just too difficult. I don't think that's what I don't think that's consistent with what we've been learning from many districts.
And before I go back to you, because I know that you wanted to respond to what Michael was saying, are there specific districts that you've visited that have implemented it in the sort of way that you're describing?
That have taken the time to first think through culture change and then think through implementation, then through policy. Not off the top of my head. One stellar district in my mind is actually Fairfax County. Fairfax, is an example where there was interaction with the Office for Civil Rights. There was an incident where a child, I believe, may have committed suicide following a suspension out of school. This is also a district that has both done quite a bit of work implementing positive behavioral intervention supports, and it's implemented quite a robust district level support system to help schools implement restorative practices. So, if I don't know about the timing, about when policy changes may have been timed with the implementation supports, but this is clearly a district that has given a lot of thought to how to roll out and support districts that are trying to, to support schools that are doing something different. And one thing that they say oftentimes is, as they're doing training, they try to make sure that teachers know, sort of when they're ready to implement new approaches. This is an issue that we often run into with restorative practices. People sort of go to 1 or 2 trainings and they say, "Oh, I'm ready. I can do this. I can hold a circle of students and we'll have a talking stick, and I know how to do this." And there's so much more to it than that. And Fairfax has really given some thought to what does it mean to train and coach and instill new skills and capacities, and when do we, how do we know when people are ready to actually, manage these new types of practices themselves, and when do they still need a coach in the room to assist?
You'll be happy to know that Senator Collins brought a talking stick to the Senate the other day. So this has made it big time here in Washington.
Just a couple of quick examples there. Broward, Brevard, Denver, Green Dot, which is a charter management organization, Mastery, which is a charter management organization, all of whom, particularly the last 2 started very much on sort of, more on the zero tolerance side, have all done, I think, good work. In Newark, we didn't change the policy until year 3, until after we'd done a lot of case for action work and building. Those are all places that I think are combining capacity building with policy. Not perfect, uneven implementation, as most big scale changes, but thoughtful work, I think, on both the kind of sort of policy stuff along with the capacity building. I have to go back, though. I have to.
I knew you were going to. That's why I was so eager to give you the opportunity.
Disruptive student conversation. So 3 things on that. First of all, biases are at play here. I mean, we have to define what disruptive is and how we define disruptive when it is in a white student versus a student of color, a boy versus a girl, an able-bodied student versus a student with disabilities. There's lots of research on this, and about, a couple just came out this year around how we think Black girls are less innocent. I mean, little when they're little, I mean, it's absurd overall, but I mean, it's even more sort of stunning. Black boys get more negative attention in kindergarten, and these are sort of observable things, right? So biases are at play, and I do get I get worried when we talk about these students, and we mean largely African American and Latino, more boys than not, although girls disproportionality has become a thing. Students with disabilities, students who are struggling with different challenges around gender identity, students who are transgender. I mean, so one thing is just they can do the exact same thing, and our response as human beings and as educators is often different. And I just don't think we should be debating that. That's true, right? My son, who is a Black boy, doesn't, we don't need a lot of, we don't necessarily need more research to show that there are biases at play in our society, and they're deeply entrenched, and they show up in all of us. I'm not saying, and that schools that do this well acknowledge that, and sort of just saying there's a group of those students, to me, I think is problematic without really acknowledging the biases that are at play and doing some smart work on how we all acknowledge that, all of us, right? So that's one. 2, it has not been my experience that there are disruptive students and everybody else, right? For goodness sakes, I have 19 nieces and nephews, all right? Wait 5 minutes when one of them is quiet, okay? And one of them is disruptive, and then wait a year and then it will flip, right? People, young people go through developmental phases, and and by the way, sometimes the quiet, compliant young people are suffering just as much. They might be struggling in silence. And so when we think about discipline, it's not just about controlling those kids, right? It's about creating a scenario where we think of discipline in the way that it is defined in sort of the original Greek root, which is on practicing something till you master it, much like you think of a disciplined artist or a disciplined athlete, right? Practicing something until you're your best self. If we think about that for all kids, sometimes the quiet, sort of shy, compliant kid is actually in just as much crisis as the kid who frankly is sort of doing something a little bit adaptive, which is showing he or she's got an issue, right? But we don't think of it that way. We think of that as being, sort of less developmentally appropriate and more problematic. In some ways, it's actually kind of smart. They're sort of saying, hey, look at me, I have some needs, right? If we thought of it that way, we wouldn't actually pathologize it. We might actually use it as an opportunity to partner with that kid, and we might use it as a flag for the kids we're not hearing from, right? That's number two. And number three, I think that there are a group of kids, having said all that, I mean, my background in terms of the young people that I've worked with. I have only worked with the young people who've experienced severe struggles in school. P.S. I taught kids who've been suspended for a year, right? And they're like among the biggest, greatest geniuses. My great belief is that those young people could lead us all to the promised land if we figure out a way to unlock their potential. They're some of the most brilliant, creative, phenomenal, non-compliant. Like, what high-performing person do we know in our society that was compliant? Like, none, right? Except we don't really like it when it comes in certain packages and when it shows up at our doorstep in schools. So, but my final point, I guess, is for those young people who are bringing a lot, right? And that's real. There are some young people who have experienced severe trauma, have frankly been told they're the disruptive kids so long that they've like put on that coat like it's a suit they can never take off. They might be experiencing extreme struggles. They want us to know that for whatever reason. And that's where things like response to intervention and PBIS and personalized learning and student support teams can really help you zero in on who needs what and how you get much more deep and differentiated supports to those young people, so that, and by the way, when you do that, it lifts all boats, because the ability to do that with that young person is actually good for everyone, including the silent ones that might be suffering. And finally, I just have to say, like, ed reform was about all means all. It was never about like we're gonna sort of serve and lift up the kids that we perceive to be compliant. It was all means all, and there's a group of kids, despite all of our best efforts, and I consider myself someone who's been working on this, that we're still failing, and they're the kids that adults perceive, quote, hardest to serve, and we're so quick to just put them in the shadows and claim success. Like, we are only as good as serving all kids. Ed reform was about all means all, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, so a lot of great stuff there, again, to agree with. And look, if you can find a way to respond to outbursts and all of that in a constructive way, great. My main point is to say that a classroom environment where kids are spending most of their time learning is something that's hugely important. And I'm totally on board with this idea about discipline being something that kids can learn from, as long as it doesn't bleed into the soft bigotry of low expectations. As long as there's some agreement that a kid dropping the F-bomb on their teacher is not okay. It doesn't matter what they're experiencing at home. It doesn't matter anything. Okay. We need to be a society where we support our teachers, and we've modeled that we think learning is important and we need a respectful environment. Now, again, maybe a suspension in that case doesn't make sense, certainly maybe not the first time, maybe there's different ways for schools to do it. All right, but the message teachers are getting, that we hear from a lot of these places, is, hey, you just got to deal with it. Or if and here I am the white guy, I'm about to say this, but if you have a problem with a kid dropping the F-bomb on you, well, that's just because you're racist, right? That is the soft bigotry of low expectations. Look, the equity thing, this is something we debate about in education all the time, right? Is, all means all versus, look, I come at this from a fairly pragmatic point of view. White, affluent kids out there in the suburbs or in private schools are in classrooms that by and large are orderly and where the kids are able to keep making lots and lots and lots of gains. And I just worry that we're creating a situation, unintentional, where a lot of African-American, Latino kids and poor kids are in classrooms where they do not get to have that same benefit, where they don't have orderly environments where they can focus on learning, because we are putting the needs of a very few number of kids above all of the rest. And that is gonna get in our way of closing achievement gaps. And so, as conservatives, look, I tend to see the world as sometimes, as much as we like to believe we can walk and chew gum and you can do everything at the same time, there are trade-offs. And sometimes there are trade-offs, and we have got to be honest about that putting all the focus on helping kids, who are not permanently disruptive, but in a certain moment, they're disruptive. Helping them might sometimes come at the cost to all of their classmates.
Mike, you're getting dangerously close to saying that white kids just behave better.
No, I'm not saying that.
You're getting close.
No, I'm saying that those schools would not stand for the kind of disorder that we make poor and minority kids put up with. That's all I'm saying.
But there's another difference between the schools that the white affluent children are attending and the schools that black and brown kids are attending. The schools that white affluent kids are attending, they have the counselors, right? The schools that black and brown children are attending, they get suspensions. They don't have the counselors. And so when you make a statement that a black or brown child, and it doesn't matter if you preface it by saying, oh, well, they're from a low-income background. They come from a poor family. That statement, Mike, places a target on the backs of those children. It sets the stage for those children to be the target of discriminatory practice. Before we talk about a child's individual characteristics, let's talk about the environments in which we've placed those children. Right now, black and brown children are twice as likely to attend a school where at least 20% of the teachers in the school are a first-year teacher. Right now, I think it's 40%. I think that the analysis was of 8th grade mathematics students. So this was the NAEP. 40% of black and brown students attend schools where at least 75% of the students in the school are free and reduced price lunch. That number drops all the way down to 6 or 7% for white students. Those are decisions. That has nothing to do with the kids. Those are decisions that us adults make. And so before we start talking about the children's behavior and how it may be tied to their race, but not really because it's actually tied to their income, we need to talk about education equity and the systems that us adults created and placed those children into. Until those systems are equal, I don't want to hear anything about disparities in behavior on the basis of race or income. Because to be quite frank, to offer income as a well, I'm not actually talking about race, I'm talking about income. We have to aspire to education systems that can do more than to take a low-income child and attach D's and suspensions to it. Right. That's not what our education system
and Kristen, but we are miscommunicating here. So this is good that we get to do this in person, not on Twitter, which is the zone of all miscommunication in the world. Look, we have the similar vision. I mean, that is what education reform is about, is making sure all schools are fantastic schools and to address these horrible inequities that we have built up over all these years so that every kid, including low-income kids, kids of color, get to go to a school with great teachers and the right resources and enough support, that kids who are disadvantaged need more resources because of all the trauma, et cetera, et cetera. We totally agree. All I'm saying is I am worried that these discipline reforms, as being implemented, are making life worse for those kids in those high poverty schools. And I think that's something we got to wrestle with. And I'm so glad to hear you say that we need to worry about the timing. But now we'll get to the federal stuff. In 2014, when the Obama administration sent that letter and made it clear to districts that if they wanted to avoid a civil rights investigation, which any district in the country wants to, they need to get their suspension rates for kids of color down. At least the way that was interpreted was you need to stop suspending kids or dramatically reduce them. There was no money. There was no extra support. And how could it be? I mean, it's too hard. None of us know how to do that from Washington. And so if we're starting to see signs out there that it's not going well, okay, because people are interpreting this as stop suspending kids, and there's no money, and there's no support, we have a serious crisis on our hands, and we might need to say, whoa, let's stop and go back and figure out how to do this the right way.
All right, for going federal, I gotta jump in here. We had a serious crisis on our hands before the guidance was issued, I would argue, right? It's called disproportional suspension of certain subgroups of students over many decades in many places. Like, I think that's a serious crisis. One, two, the federal law around civil rights exists. I mean, that is, people may or may not be happy about that. I happen to be very happy about that. And the role of the federal government has been well established through case law and other things to protect the civil rights of all of us in particular groups have been discriminated against. So if you repeal the guidance, you don't repeal that, right? All the guidance did was remind us, guess what? There's a law.
No, it didn't.
Follow it.
It did much more.
But I was going to say, number 3, I know I received it. I was a sitting superintendent at the time, and it actually did say, dear colleagues, we're pointing out we have a crisis. Here's the data, right? And it turned the lights on, and you know what? I actually happen to think that was a pretty good thing. And for us in Newark, we were already on the pathway. It sort of gave a lift to it in our sales. It gave us an even greater sense of urgency than we already had. It made us feel like we were part of a broader movement, sort of, much like the standards movement did, in all the right ways. And much like, sort of adding choice schools did in all the ways that you support, right? It gave that sort of air of buoyancy. And it also, in there, I thought, provided some very good research, some very good tools, some very good tips. And to me, it read like, dear everyone, we have a crisis, which I agreed with. Dear everyone, we have a federal law we're prepared to enforce. Well, okay. And dear everyone, get on it. Here's some stuff that you can do, and here's some research about how to get moving. The time is now. And frankly, I didn't see much wrong with that. And so is it being implemented, well across the country? Heck no. Did we do it perfectly even where I was? Heck no. Is that a reason to actually return to the status quo? I would say absolutely not. So I didn't actually receive the guidance the way that it's been described. I don't think the guidance, the way that it's being articulated, I don't think, I think it spurred a lot of action. Some of it was good, some of it was not awesome, but I would say it was far from awesome when we were all pretending like we didn't have a problem. So as far as I'm concerned, it was a very important shot in the arm and a reminder that, that there is a role for the federal government to play in upholding civil rights. And I don't personally have a problem with that.
And Michael, would you say that the conditions now are indeed worse than they were before the letter?
Well, first, let me just say that if the letter was just as Cami just described it, fine. I mean, it's like one of another. Lots of guidance goes out from the feds, and okay, no big deal. The reason it's a big deal is it did fundamentally change federal policy. It used to be that if you believe that you were treated unfairly, that you were discriminated against, which, as Cami said, there's certainly evidence that happens, and nobody would dispute that happens out there. You got treated more harshly than a white kid did for the same thing. You have a right to file a complaint. The Office for Civil Rights has a responsibility to come in and check it out, look at all the facts in the case. The difference here was saying that it gave the federal government the power to launch on its own volition investigations into school districts where just based on seeing these discipline disparities and without any controls, without looking by school, anything, just raw disparities, right? Which look, if you study bureaucracies and compliance, I mean, regulated industries generally, and districts are no less, they don't like having federal people come and checking them out, certainly not civil rights investigators. So that was threatening, but then to even say, and once they're there, even if they go in, the first question is there an adverse impact? Meaning, is there, are you disproportionately suspending certain groups and others? Not looking at behavior, not looking at anything. So it's that stuff that really worried us. And by the way, not to get too much into the law, but in other areas of disparate impact, like, the classic cases when fire departments used to discriminate against people of color, well, then they were not allowed to do it anymore, but they came up with saying, well, you have to pass the standardized test to be a firefighter. It had nothing to do with the job. It was a court that could adjudicate, is this test that you're using, is this reasonable, or is this just an excuse to discriminate people of color? In this case, there's no court, there's no hearing. The districts, it's the Office for Civil Rights employees who are judge and jury. They come in and you have to prove to them that your policies, are, that there's no other alternatives than your policies and discipline, and that they have some educational purpose. And it's these civil rights investigators that get to decide that. So, look, we've seen hundreds of cases open in recent years. We still see, the other day, Milwaukee agreed to an agreement with the Office for Civil Rights, really basically the focus where we're going to suspend a lot fewer kids. So this is what concerns us, is there was this huge shift. If the guidance goes away, the policy goes away, there will still be protections for kids who believe they were discriminated against can file a complaint as it should be. And I'm sure that if the letter goes away, and I'm hopeful that it will, there's still going to be a movement to reform discipline. Districts are still going to, still going to be energy around that. But critically, we could figure out a better way to match resources with the policy, which you just can't do if it's coming from the feds.
So I'm gonna give you a second right now. Just hold on. So I think what the point that you might be missing, Mike, is that racism is institutionalized bias. You do not know, you cannot prove if racism exists if you don't have data. That is the point of the guidance, to say if you have these disparate rates of suspensions, it could lead to an investigation. It didn't say it will, it said it could, right? So would you agree that it is part of the role of the federal government to ensure that racism does not exist, especially within public institutions?
Look, I would agree that it is the role of the Office for Civil Rights to investigate specific complaints of discrimination. I would not agree that just looking at racial disparities proves that racial discrimination is at play. I think the research,
no one's saying
but that's what the guidance did say, is that it implied that 100% of those disparities were caused by bias, either implicit or otherwise, whereas it might be part.
The guidance didn't say that.
It said in the guidance, it pointed to research saying, research shows that these disparities cannot be explained by differences in behavior. Those are the words.
It didn't, it said that all of the disparities cannot be explained.
Go look, I swear, I just wrote about this.
And to be clear, I didn't actually write it myself. I was in elementary and secondary education. I was in OSERS. I wasn't in OCR. But the beautiful thing about this conversation is you do not have to take our word for it. The guidance is posted. I invite you all to read it. Please, please read it. The guidance said two things. And in saying these two things, it did not establish new policy, new requirements. It simply explained current civil rights law. Number one, you may not treat students differently on the basis of race. We know that one. And this could be for a policy that is explicitly, in the letter of it, discriminatory. We don't see those too often. Or for a facially neutral policy that is used differently. Two students, they both get into a fight. One's white, one's black, one's not suspended, one is. That's, just overt discriminatory practice. You may not do that. The second is disparate impact. The second is a policy neutral in its face that is actually implemented equally, that has a disparate impact based on race. But the conversation doesn't end there. Simply having that policy and simply having a disparate impact based on race does not on its own mean that you have violated civil rights law. You also have to ask, is this policy necessary to achieve an educational outcome? You also have to ask, are there available alternatives? Think about what we heard on the last panel. We heard on the last panel that when you implement suspensions, that there's detriment to these children down the line, and it actually can decrease their academic achievement. Raises a question pretty large in our minds whether or not the use of a suspension can help to achieve an educational outcome. It's also quite questionable from the research whether or not a suspension can conserve the use of safety. Now, to use a suspension when there is an imminent threat to an imminent threat of injury, an imminent threat of safety. In those cases, a suspension might be warranted just to cool things down, just to make sure nobody gets hurt. But when we're talking about nonviolent offenses, and to be clear, when we look at disparities in discipline, there's practically no disparities when you look at suspensions that follow violent offenses. It's the suspensions for nonviolent offenses is where we are seeing the disparity. So if we know that suspensions can reduce a child's likelihood of academic success, and if we know that if we question that suspensions are actually useful in promoting school safety, then on what basis can we say that a suspension that fuels disparities on the basis of race help to serve an education goal? It doesn't. And so, that's what the guidance was trying to explain. That's what it was successful, honestly,
And
in
Kristen,
explaining. And so I really do encourage folks to read the guidance yourselves and understand what it means. Because I think much of this conversation changes dramatically when we try to say, the guidance did X and the guidance did Y and the guidance empowered OCR to do this. Let's be real clear and get on the same page about what it is the guidance did and did not do.
Very quick.
but Kristen, I think you kind of made my point. I mean, that is exactly what the guidance says, is that if there's a disparate impact, you have to prove that there's an educational benefit to your policy. And as you said, the guidance made it clear that the answer is no. We are going to find that there is not an educational benefit to your discipline if it's suspending kids for nonviolent offenses, like dropping the F-bomb on a teacher. So now we have a situation where 14,000 school districts' discipline policies are being overseen and overruled by Federal Office for Civil Rights investigators. And that is at the heart of the question, is that a good system? And again, being done at a time when there's no extra money, there's no extra support, there's no plan for how we're going to implement these changes.
So Mike, we promised we wouldn't delve too much into the federal policy.
I know.
Look, you're the one getting into that. So I wanted to kind of move past this because I feel like we're all getting in our own rabbit holes and sort of looking forward. I mean, it seems like clearly people, it doesn't seem like we're ever going to come to a consensus. Like I'm not optimistic. How do we kind of, leverage the fact that we do have some common goals and values, and sort of get away from this sort of exploitation of data and accusing the other side of manipulating the data to prove one's cause? How do we move past this and really, because we're talking about our kids and we often forget about that. Really, we're talking about kids and often the most vulnerable kids. So how do we? What is the next step? How do we get past these this chasm and really come up with a compromise that benefits children?
Well, one thing I'll just dive in here. Obviously, I'm a little passionate about this, but I mean, something there actually have been some very important moments of agreement, right? One of which is, policy alone is insufficient. That we need to be very clear what schools need to know and be able to do in order to move away from exclusionary discipline towards something. We can't just be against something. We have to be for something, and we have to be real clear about what that is and what the research base of it is, as well as some of the R&D that we all need to do together to make sure that it actually works. Right? I mean, PBIS and restorative practices, use them both. Like they're not a silver. I don't even want to use that bellicose language. They're not. There's no one sort of burning answer. And frankly, both of those, I described kind of the 5 things that need to be true: the 3 proactive, the 2 reactive. Those PBIS and restorative practices are like dots on a much bigger continuum of things. When we decided 3-4 years ago that we needed more rigor in our classrooms, that we were having young people do too low-level work, rote memorization. We weren't keeping pace with growing economy and other countries, and we're falling behind PISA. We all said, hey, we got to sort of go deeper and, deeper learning and higher standards, Common Core, whatever you want to call it. Don't call it Common Core or else we're going to start fighting again. But there was a rigor revolution, right? We all sort of said, like, regardless of what you want to call it and whether the Fed should be involved or not and, how to wrap it up, we need more rigor in our classrooms. We need meaningful work. We need young people to do fewer things much better and much deeper, and we need to look to the future towards 21st century learning. And we changed our practices. There were resources involved. There was R&D involved. There was, we didn't fight about whether. We moved to the how. Right? So this is why we call it the Discipline Revolution Project, because I was like, we need the same revolution in this conversation around the practices and the capacity and that we had around rigor, right? I think we made a shift. And I frankly think that the folks who should be leading the charge are those that have the most flexibility, the best leadership, right? This is why in our work at DRP, we're working with districts and also with charters, because, charters were meant to be a place of R&D to, sort of do things bigger, better, faster than, the big bad districts that are saddled with legacy. Obviously, I don't believe that because I'm a proud, superintendent. So I actually think we're going to get stuck if we think about it, the suspension factories as they've been called, where our children actually go to school. I think the people who need to lead the charge are actually those that have, the sort of flexibility and resources. And I think we can at least sort of commit to the status quo, right? And I've heard you say this, where we were, as far as sort of not having a frank conversation about racial disparities, as far as not having a frank conversation about the deep costs of zero tolerance, as far as not seeing the correlation between sort of quote unquote discipline policy and school climate and student outcomes, as far as sort of devolving to silly arguments about whether or not we should believe in rigor alongside, smart relationships. P.S. If you don't have healthy relationships, you can't learn. Instead of that, let's sort of like embrace the like bigger, better, faster on the content R&D, the commitment to the how. Lots of hows, lots of smarts, lots of studying of the hows, not whether, and not get sidelined by whether. I happen to have my own views about how we have to push. You need like, the sort of ground up and top down and everything else, because I personally have been on the receiving end of this status quo for so many years. Like, I'm ready for the revolution, however it comes, and it's never always, even. But I do want to sort of say that I appreciated in this conversation the common ground on the status quo is unacceptable. Right. And we don't have to reject this as a moment where we have to choose rigor or something else. And that we do need to really focus on implementation and support and get much smarter about the how and the towards what end, across sort of lines that divide us.
I also think the narrative about how we've gotten to today needs to accurately reflect the voices and the effort that have been that brought us to today, and to narrow that narrative to talk about federal government versus schools or civil rights activists versus the education field at large, I think does our state education officials, our school district leaders an incredible disservice. It does our teachers an incredible disservice. Here's one thing that happened. I think it was in March of 2012. The New York Permanent Judicial Commission on Justice for Children, led by then, Justice Judith Kaye, former Supreme Court Justice for the state of New York, convened a massive number of people representing 46 states, and they represented, state education officials. They represented judicial officials from across the country to come and have a conversation about how to dismantle what we were calling then the school to prison pipeline. This was not a federal project. This was a project started in the states by a state judicial leader calling out to education for help. We had justices knocking on doors of education saying, we have certain kids ending up in our courtrooms. We don't want these kids in our courtrooms. We got to do better about addressing these behaviors on the school side so that we don't end up with so many kids entering the juvenile justice system. So you're talking about years then of a collaboration between education and judicial officials to try to find new approaches. Years later, and here's where, the federal government did step in, and this was work that I was involved in. And at that point, our approach was really, oh my goodness, how can we help you? What do you need? What questions do you need answered? What practices do you need to know about? How can we help? 22 teams, from states. Actually, I think it's 20 state teams and 2 district teams. 12 people from California, 12 people from New York City, 12 people from Michigan, 12 people from Texas, and I think everybody, we had teams of 8 from the others, representing again justice, education, but representing parents, teachers, principals, trying to sit down together to figure out, how do we find ways to address student behavior in ways that keep kids in school. The history of the school discipline reform movement is an inclusive one. It is one that has absolutely involved the voices of teachers and the voices of young people who have stepped forward and said, I don't want to be in a school where I feel like I'm in a prison. I want stronger relationships with my teachers. I want people that I can talk with when I'm feeling upset. I need to be able to say I need help. Where teachers, are saying, I want this. I came here to promote education equity. That's what I'm in this for, but I don't know how. Show me how. This effort has always been about advancing education equity, supporting students and teachers. To the extent we find today that in some places we've done incredibly well, in some places we haven't done so well, it's simply an indication that that kind of collaboration, that kind of broad-based, all hands on deck, continuing to ask questions needs to continue.
Well, thank you, everyone. Glad we could end on that note and not the earlier one. Yeah, so I guess Q&A, yeah. If anyone in the audience has questions, and I guess they'll pass around mics.
Whew. Bring on the beer.
Yes. No one? Not at all?
The survey?
Oh, is there something?
They want the beer and the wine. Right?
I have a question, but
we need the mic.
rabbit hole. Is that okay?
Yeah, use the mic, Annie, for the online.
Right, so I'm gonna go down a rabbit hole. So, were there a lot of cases where after that letter was written, that the federal government did get involved and found that there was disparate impact, and it didn't seem that they put fairness as, part of what their reasoning?
First of all, it's hard to know because so much of this is not transparent, but Max Eden has been busy FOIAing the Department of Education, and it looks like there's a couple hundred cases that have been opened in recent years, and most of which have not been closed. I mean, these things go on for years and years. We saw one pop the other day with Milwaukee. It certainly looks to me like the message is you need to suspend fewer kids. Like that's the main message. And look, but the common ground is important. I am hopeful. Look, I think most likely the administration is going to remove this letter. I'd be very surprised if they don't. I'm hopeful that allows us to put implementation before policy again, that we can therefore, the districts will no longer have this sword of Damocles over their heads coming from the federal government, and instead we can get back to focusing on winning over hearts and minds in the way Kristen was talking about, which is great, and do it from a bottom-up perspective. And look, a lot of it is the same work we've already been doing for 20 or 30 years. Like, how do you fix dysfunctional schools, especially big high schools that are not working well? That is hard work, but we can do that work. And I just say, look, what will it take for the discipline reformers? What evidence will you need to see to be convinced that it's not going well in some places and that it's getting dangerous? Because I think we're starting to see some evidence of that in some places. And look, when teacher evaluations didn't work well or Common Core implementation wasn't great, the stakes weren't as high. The stakes feel higher on this one, and we've got to be open to the idea that it's not going well in some places, and we need to fix that. And if we in Washington or we at the state level don't have the money or the resources or the ability to provide all that support that's needed, then we've got to say, whoa, let's stop and let's figure this out.
Kristen, do you want to respond to
Yes, please. Just quickly. I am not seeing the crisis that my co-panelist is describing when it comes to school safety. To the extent that any child says, I don't feel safe in school, that's a problem. To the extent any child says, I'm bringing weapons to school, that's a problem. Look at the national statistics on safety. Over the last 10 years, we have seen consistent decreases in the rates of children saying, I feel unsafe, and the rates of children saying, I stayed home because I feel unsafe, and the rates of children saying, I brought a weapon to school, and the rates of children saying, I engaged in a fight when I'm at school. All four of those indicators have been decreasing over the last 10 years. Los Angeles. Los Angeles is one of the districts that said, we're going to say no to suspensions for willful defiance. Those same four indicators, same pattern.
So here's what we see in Philadelphia.
Here, Matt, catch.
So here's what we see in Philadelphia. Following the 1213 reform, comparing Philadelphia to other districts in the state of Pennsylvania who didn't reform their policy, pardon me, serious incidents of misconduct went up, and suspensions for more serious infractions went up. So I think, and I understand the data that you're referring to, but we also need to, I think, be a little bit more level-headed about what's actually being observed following reform, right? And again, this varies depending on the context, right? And I think, again, as we talked about in the earlier panel, the context of reform varies across districts. But again, in Philadelphia, when they reform the policy, right, we see this rise in more serious misconduct. So this notion that there may not be behavioral or safety concerns following reform, at least in the Philadelphia context, doesn't seem to have been realized, right?
So to be clear,
Yep.
I do not suffer from the delusion that some schools, some districts have had trouble implementing discipline reform. In no way. But I am speaking directly to this idea of crisis. And I'm suggesting that this idea that there is a crisis, that we have to pull back all of the work that we've done on school discipline reform, that we have to put the suspensions back in place, that we should encourage schools to return to using suspensions is misguided. And I'm suspecting that crisis, large scale, schools everywhere turning to pandemonium, I'm saying that's not happening. Now, where we are, and this has happened, it's not hard to find articles where teachers have started raising an alarm, especially in the very early years of a discipline reform effort, where there wasn't a thought to timing between culture change and implementation supports, coaching for teachers, and policy. Teachers are saying, they're asking me to do something different. I agree that something needs to change, but I haven't gotten the help I need yet. By all means, we need to rethink how we're supporting teachers, all with y'all in.
And I think Abby wanted
Did you want to respond?
I just wanted to add to what Matthew said. I think it is important to pay attention to as his study observed, what was happening in Philadelphia following the new policy implementation. And to that end, I think it's important to mention that there are other factors that influence these districts that we need to pay attention to. Philadelphia, that comparison compared Philadelphia to the rest of the state. Philadelphia in those very years was hit with massive budget cuts, far disproportionate to the rest of the state. Philadelphia, which serves roughly 10% of the students in Pennsylvania, absorbed roughly 25% of the losses in state education funding. So I agree that happened. That was the order of the incidents, but there were also other factors. We cannot clearly say that was the result of that policy change. And I know that Matthew and I have discussed this before, and that he agrees.
I'll disagree with that. Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah.
We'll do it later over drinks.
Yeah.
All right.
At least in theory, I'll disagree.
Well,
Yeah.
first of all, please thank the fantastic panel and Aaliyah for moderating, and our earlier one. Look, as promised, this is an incredibly difficult issue. Okay, I mean, here we are talking about one of the most divisive issues in education, one that has implications around race. We're doing it in the Trump era. I mean, this is not easy to do. I know many of you, and certainly everybody on Twitter that I've been looking at Twitter, disagrees with my position on that. That's fine. I hope we modeled disagreeing without being disagreeable and doing it, I mean, having strong views, and you can tell we're all very passionate, but doing it in a way that's respectful and hopefully constructive. So let's keep the conversation going. All right, thanks everybody. If you're here, please join us for the reception. If you're not here, have one at home. We're going to skip that because we have more important things to do right now. All right, thanks guys. Appreciate it.